I was a Marxist when I entered the University of Chicago. I was not a Marxist when I left. These words from Thomas Sowell mark one of the most dramatic intellectual transformations in American economics. But to understand how a committed Marxist became one of free market capitalism's most influential defenders, we need to go back to where it all began. Thomas Sowell was born on June 30th, 1930, in Gastonia, North Carolina, during the depths of the Great Depression and the height of Jim Crow segregation. His father died shortly before he was born, and his mother died in childbirth when he was still young. With no parents to care for him, he was raised by his great-aunt Molly in a small wooden house with no electricity and no running water. The family was poor, but young Thomas didn't fully realize it at the time. Ignorance was bliss, and cheaper. In their rural North Carolina community, almost everyone lived the same way. Poverty was simply the normal condition of life. At age 9, his great-aunt moved the family to Harlem. For young Thomas, the move was overwhelming. He had never seen indoor plumbing, electric lights, or this many people and buildings packed so tightly. He sat next to white kids of all nationalities and saw people with blonde hair for the first time, something he thought existed only in comic books. He had only known segregated all-black schools back in North Carolina. Harlem had no whites-only signs on water fountains, no separate entrances to buildings. The suffocating restrictions of Jim Crow were gone, replaced by a different kind of struggle, but one that felt more hopeful. Tom discovered libraries, where he could read anything he wanted without restrictions, and realized that the world was far larger and more complex than the small North Carolina community where he was born. But life in the cramped apartment wasn't easy. His great-aunt, the woman he called mother, ruled the household with strict control and expected everyone to follow her rules without question. Thomas, growing older and more independent, began to push back. The tensions grew. His great-aunt would tell lies about him to other family members. During one heated argument, she threatened Tom with a hammer. Thomas didn't back down. He looked at her and said, "Do it, but you better not miss." This wasn't recommended in any parenting books. She didn't swing, but the relationship was broken beyond repair. It wasn't just a 17-year-old kid talking back, it was a preview of the man Tom would become. When confronted with authority, he didn't respect, he didn't negotiate, he didn't compromise. He dared them to follow through. Decades later, he'd use the same approach with university deans, federal bureaucrats, and White House chiefs of staff. She took Tom to court, hoping the authorities could control him. The government as substitute parent, a recurring theme in American life. At the hearing, Thomas made his position clear. He told the judge he would refuse to do anything his great-aunt didn't have the legal right to force him to do. That included simple things like taking her home from the courthouse. The judge ruled that Thomas, at 17, could leave if he chose to. Walking out of the apartment felt more like being released from prison, earlier than expected. His first stop was buying a small suitcase, which was enough for everything he owned. Thomas found a room at the Fifth Avenue for $6 a week, a tiny room with just a bed, a chair, a chest, and a gas heater. No closet, just a nail on the back of the door to hang his clothes. Minimalism before it was trendy. He paid the rent by working as a Western Union messenger, delivering telegrams across Manhattan for 40 cents an hour, walking miles every day in all weather. Soon he moved to 163rd Street and Amsterdam Avenue in Upper Manhattan, close to a library. He could now check out books for free and spend hours reading. Thomas bought the same groceries most weeks for $13.75. Rent was $5.75 a week. The subway cost him 50 cents a week. It all added up to $20. His weekly earnings were $22.50, leaving him with just $2.50 for everything else. The poverty line hadn't been invented yet, but he was well below it. Most teenagers would go to the movies with the extra money. Tom bought an old encyclopedia for $1.17, determined to educate himself. He also enrolled at Stuyvesant High School, but eventually dropped out. He was now working 2 jobs at Western Union and machine shops. Education, he told himself, would have to wait. Years later, Sowell would write extensively about institutions failing poor students. He would criticize throwing money at schools without addressing poverty, distinguishing between school quality versus student circumstances, and fight against lowering standards for struggling students. At one of the machine shops, he met a man named Ed, someone who would reappear in his life years later. Ed even lent money to Tom when he couldn't afford food. Before government assistance, there was just assistance. The machine shop work taught him practical skills, but more importantly, it showed him there were people in the working world who valued competence over credentials. Then, in December 1950, an envelope arrived drafting him for the Korean War. The war had begun in June, and the military needed men. At 20 years old, Thomas was going into the Marines. Before reporting for duty, he took a civil service exam and thought of continuing a government position after the military. The results were in the high 90s, and the letter said he was eligible for a government job when he returned. It was something to hold on to. Boot camp at Paris Island was brutal. The heat was suffocating. The drill instructors were relentless. Thomas had grown up poor and worked hard jobs, but nothing prepared him for the Marine Corps. They broke you down to rebuild you their way. Modern universities would borrow this technique minus the rebuilding part. He endured it. He had no other option. After boot camp, the Marines gave him a test to determine his assignment. Thomas scored exceptionally high, and instead of being sent to Korea as a rifleman, he was assigned to the photography unit at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. The photo lab work was technical but manageable. He learned how to operate professional cameras, develop negatives, and print photographs. The skills were useful, but more importantly, the job gave him structure and stability he'd never had before. The Marine Corps always felt like skating on thin ice for Thomas. After an inspection one Saturday, he was summoned to the first sergeant's office. "I don't recall seeing you out there during the inspection. What do you have to say for yourself?" the sergeant demanded. "Nothing," Thomas said. "And why is that?" "I am not responsible for the memory of first sergeants." Somehow, this didn't improve their relationship. The sergeant did not like him. He told Thomas that he would be the first sent to Korea and tried repeatedly to catch Thomas doing something wrong. He almost succeeded. But before anything came of it, the sergeant himself was sent to Korea. Thomas only had 5 months left to serve, and the policy only permitted sending troops to Korea who had more than a year left. Although drafted to serve for 2 years, Thomas took advantage of an early discharge program the Marine Corps was experimenting with. He ended up serving for 1 year, 11 months, and 5 days. But who's counting? Thomas returned to New York, but didn't resume his old relationships. He got a job at Willoughby's camera store and enrolled in night school to earn his college diploma. Shortly after, he returned to Washington. As a military veteran, he was eligible for his old government job and would receive all the raises he'd missed during his service. By then, racial segregation patterns had been eliminated in many areas. He could eat at restaurants in the better parts of the city. Thomas rented a place near Howard University and paid for it with his government salary. He started taking 15 semester hours at night. He could now afford a few amenities and bought a record player. But because he couldn't afford many records, he listened to Scheherazade repeatedly. It opened his eyes to classical music. Later in life, nothing moved him more deeply than the Grieg Piano Concerto. While racial policies were changing in some ways, in others they stayed the same. Thomas worked in the black section of the General Accounting Office, where rules were stricter. Being late meant signing tardy next to your name and losing an hour of pay. Most employees didn't know their rights, but Thomas refused to sign. If they docked his pay, he told them he'd protest to the Civil Service Commission. When other black employees learned this, they thought he was in with someone in high places. Competence was so rare, it looked like corruption. Some asked if he was sleeping with their boss. In his sociology class, the professor told students about the Supreme Court overruling separate but equal and asked for everyone's opinion. Students had a utopian view and thought it would lead to a magic solution. When Thomas spoke, he said, "It's been 50 years since Plessy versus Ferguson, and we still don't have separate but equal." This was not a popular opinion, but Thomas could already see that legal victories don't automatically translate to real-world change. This skepticism about grand solutions, his insistence on looking at actual results rather than good intentions, would become the defining feature of his career. In September 1954, Thomas moved into his own apartment for the first time, a landmark in his life. He had his own telephone and an old TV that Mary Frances had gifted him, but he had to sell his favorite camera to afford it all. At Howard, a writing professor, Sterling Brown, asked students to bring their best writing to the first class. Thomas was still proud of a short story he'd written years ago for a literary agent. Brown's criticism of the manuscript was longer than the manuscript itself, but worse of all, it was true. The short story Thomas had cherished was rubbish. He realized how much he still had to learn. Unfortunately, most faculty weren't as serious about their subjects as Mr. Brown. Neither were the students. When Thomas mentioned this to Brown, he smiled. "You see, Thomas, we are not as far off the plantation as you might think." Thomas got accepted to Harvard. Going to a different college would mean giving up his apartment and returning to cramped living. It wasn't an easy gamble. Harvard offered financial aid as a loan. His college board scores were well above average. Mrs. G, one of his favorite professors at Howard, helped him find a place near Harvard. Mr. Brown gave him advice. "Don't come back here and tell me you didn't make it 'cause white folks were mean." He understood the pitfalls of a victim mentality. This, and the quote about plantations, would remain with Tom decades later when he wrote about black education. The problem wasn't racism from outside, it was low expectations from within. Thomas's roommates at Harvard were Nort and Ralph, both outstanding students. Their habits were valuable models. Tom's verbal test scores were slightly higher than the average Harvard student. His math was behind. He had considered math his best subject, but he'd been away from it for a decade while reading constantly. Howard University hadn't prepared him for Harvard. At the end of his first semester, he had 2 D's and 2 F's. He couldn't back out. Every penny went to his studies. His future income was already mortgaged by loans. Desperate, he started taking energy pills to stay awake. Soon, he became immune. During Christmas, he did nothing but read. He felt more prepared for the last month and final exams. Tom made C's in everything, a moral victory after such a bad start. Thomas received A's in almost all his economics classes and chose to major in it. He read Karl Marx in his spare time and wrote a thesis on him to graduate with honors. He knew Marx backward and forward. The thesis was later published in scholarly journals. Thomas Sowell, the future champion of free markets, graduated from Harvard with honors by writing about Karl Marx. The irony would be lost on his critics decades later, who'd accuse him of never understanding socialism. He understood better than most of them, he just stopped believing in it. Summers meant earning money. The scholarships didn't cover full tuition, even with GI Bill money. In 1956 and 1957, he lived more poorly than when he was a delivery boy. Thomas graduated Harvard and applied to Columbia to study history of economic thought under George J. Stigler. He turned down a larger fellowship from the University of Chicago, but in fall 1958, when he arrived at Columbia, he learned Stigler had moved to Chicago. Tuition had gone up, his fellowship wouldn't cover it, but the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation came through with additional funds. Summer 1959, Thomas worked as a clerk typist at the U.S. Public Health Service in Washington. One day, a man had a heart attack and was taken to the nurse's room. They asked if he was a government employee. If so, he could be treated. He wasn't. They called an ambulance to a local hospital. The man died waiting for a doctor in a building full of doctors. This was Thomas's lesson on bureaucracy and its emphasis on procedures over results. Most people would call this a tragedy and move on. Thomas saw it as data. This was how bureaucracies worked. Not maliciously, but mechanically, rules mattered more than outcomes. This single incident would inform decades of his writing on government programs. He'd seen firsthand how good intentions and strict procedures could combine to kill someone. Thomas knew Chicago had a reputation for conservatism. They knew he was a Marxist, but both were devoted to intellectual standards and argumentation. He had more respect for Chicago than Harvard. Milton Friedman was his advisor. Thomas took his course on price theory. Friedman didn't permit students to interrupt. If they were late, they had to turn around and go home. Thomas didn't realize how difficult it was until he was one of only 2 people who got a B on the exam. There were no A's. One of the most important things Thomas learned was an essay by Friedrich Hayek, The Use of Knowledge in Society. It was assigned in Friedman's course. It took nearly 20 years for Thomas to understand its importance and write his book Knowledge and Decisions. Students are often in no position to judge relevance until long after the fact. Thomas stumbled upon the philosophy of William James and Charles Sanders Peirce. He later put one of Peirce's quotes at the top of his syllabus. Many a man has cherished for years as his hobby some vague shadow of an idea, too meaningless to be positively false. He was showing them that many ideas people hold on to are so vaguely defined that they can't even be proven wrong. In winter 1959, Thomas finally took a course under George Stigler. He'd already learned to question some of Stigler's conclusions, but his intellect and wit made it difficult. When Chicago went through economic hardship, Stigler called Thomas aside and produced an envelope. "You might want to take a look at this." It was an offer from the Earhart Foundation, which Thomas had never heard of or applied to. It was a larger fellowship than the one that had been cancelled. Thomas got a job at the Labor Department, his first contact with public policy after being immersed in theory at Chicago. He studied the sugar industry of Puerto Rico, where the Labor Department was setting minimum wages. He was in favor of it until he saw unemployment rise, which Stigler had taught it was hard to ignore. The union said it was due to hurricanes making sugar production harder. It was difficult to verify. Thomas announced a solution to the union. "We need the statistics on the amount of sugar cane standing in the field before the hurricanes to verify this." There were no such statistics. Getting them from the Department of Agriculture meant going through the Secretary of Labor, who would forward it through the chain of command. Many approvals required. Thomas asked to file a request himself. It was 1960. He hasn't received a response yet. This made him realize government agencies have their own interests, regardless of those the programs were meant to help. After getting acquainted with more government programs, he realized most weren't a net benefit to society. Not the University of Chicago, but this experience began his shift. It was gradual, sparing him the traumatic conversion other Marxists suffered. The academic year beginning fall 1960 was his last year required for the PhD. He could take exams and classes in absentia. Thomas was anxious. He was 30 with nothing to his name. Unable to find a teaching job, he returned to Chicago, suspecting he might have to drift until things sorted themselves out. 3 federal agencies offered Thomas a job: the Bureau of the Budget, the Federal Reserve System, and the Labor Department. He took the Labor Department as a GS9 management intern, a role grooming him for leadership. Some resented it. He withdrew from the program, but his day-to-day work as an economist didn't change. Finally, Thomas passed all exams for his PhD. Teaching offers started coming. Douglas College in New Jersey interviewed him. It was a women's college, almost all white. He was an unmarried black male. Their concern was that he was a Marxist. Ironic, considering what universities would become. He told them he'd be teaching economics, not his political philosophy. After a few exchanges, he thought it was a wasted day, but a week later he got the offer and accepted. Thomas had a good apartment overlooking the campus and the Raritan River. He assigned heavy reading in his first class, expecting students to drop out. None did. His salary was 20% lower than government work, but he decided this was what he wanted to do, possibly for the rest of his life. The students were bright but wanted package education. His class was designed to make them think for themselves. Some responded, others were confused. A faculty member told Thomas that students liked him, but had one complaint. He never invited them to his home. Thomas said his home was a bachelor apartment, not a place to invite young ladies. The faculty member replied, "How did you get to be such an old fogey at such a young age?" At first, Thomas thought teaching women would be the same as teaching men and disregarded their sex, but some acknowledgement was good. One day he remarked, "Since this product is purchased mainly by women, the demand for it is obviously unstable." Boos and hisses followed, then laughter. Today, this would have been a federal case. Humor had a longer shelf life in 1964. Many students planned to go into teaching, though Thomas thought them capable of more challenging work. At the time, most women didn't continue their education and were less likely to receive fellowships. Over time, his relationship with students became more relaxed, but he kept a line neither of them was to cross. Not that he was oblivious to the attractive women around him. At times, he felt like the ancient marine. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Thomas noticed obvious performance differences between his classes. One class was still much better than the other. He stopped grading on a curve. Why should a good performer be rated based on who happened to be in class with them? Students complained to the department chairman. "Tom," he said, "you seem to aim your classes at A and B students, not at C and D." "That's true, but A and B students can get by without you. It's the C's and D's that need your help most. You've got to scoop lower." A and B students need as much help systematizing their thinking as anyone else. Nobody is born with letters C and D on their foreheads. Why should I punish those who came here to learn for those who didn't? Well, what do you intend to do? I don't know. A few days later, Thomas left his resignation in the chairman's mailbox. This was not a case of stubbornness. This was a principle Thomas defended his entire career, no matter who the students or faculty were. You learn by struggling with hard problems, not when given easy answers. If you went to school, you will notice that any professor that cared about his students and his subject was very strict in grading. Thomas had no job lined up. Early in 1963, he received inquiries from Howard University and American University. Howard's offer was too vague, even about basic facts. American University received him warmly. The president offered him the position during the interview, saying Thomas would be their first full-time Negro faculty member. Thomas said he'd provide his answer after returning to New Brunswick. Days later, a letter withdrew the offer, explaining that additional information had changed their minds. Since he'd only taught at one institution, he knew where the information came from. He was branded as someone who neglected students. Meanwhile, his articles were being printed in scholarly journals. In the 1960s, media gave heavy coverage to racial issues, giving prominence to civil rights organizations and freelance black spokesmen. One was James Baldwin, who glared from the screen. "I've just come from seeing a dead boy, and you killed him." "Not me, Jim," Thomas thought. "I was in my apartment all day." Apparently, society was to blame for a man in his 20s who died of an overdose. More specifically, white society. I think I saw something very similar in 2020. Howard University finally offered Thomas a position with a summer research grant. He accepted and began teaching in summer 1963. His first class was at night, which meant more serious students. He decided not to lower grading standards. The exam results were as good as those at Douglas. Financially, things were hard. The promised summer grant turned out to be a lie. After contacting officials, Thomas learned he wasn't eligible because he wouldn't officially become faculty until September. This had been told to the department chairman explicitly. Thomas wrote to the chairman calling him a liar. The chairman was out of the country, and Thomas wanted to quit. Milton Friedman and George Stigler urged him not to. Quitting in the first week would violate academic norms. Looking back, Thomas thought he should have quit and let the chips fall where they may. Fall students weren't as good as in his summer class. Many had the behavioral issues of high schoolers, but the worst was cheating. Most students cheat at some point, but here it was a way of life. Thomas knew that behind each kid was a father driving a cab or a mother scrubbing floors to send them to school. He couldn't let immaturity take over his class. He printed different versions of exams to make cheating impossible. At first, this meant many failing grades and complaints to the dean. The dean called him in. "This is not Harvard. How do you expect higher standards if I permit cheating? We have to be reasonable. These kids can't handle graphs and abstractions." Yes, they can, but won't as long as the administration intervenes on their behalf. It's my job to intervene when a teacher isn't doing their job. You can have my resignation anytime. I'm here to produce results, not popularity. When students realized Thomas was continuing on the same path, some dropped out, but most started to apply themselves. Over time, they learned and equaled exam results from Douglas. Some new students joined, interested to challenge themselves. The students understood what the dean couldn't. You can't learn without being challenged. Decades later, when Thomas wrote about the soft bigotry of low expectations, he was thinking of administrators like this, people who confused excuses with compassion. When word of his resignation became public, many students confessed they'd misjudged him. Some urged him to stay, others were angry. How are we to advance if people like you come here for a year and leave? Thomas had no answer then or now, but staying long-term wasn't viable. In 1964, Thomas accepted a job at AT&T, then the world's largest corporation. He moved to Greenwich Village in New York. A bigger change was getting married. At AT&T, he was an economic analyst. He recommended one of his bright Howard students for a job. Officials phoned, impressed with the contrast between this young man and anyone else they'd tried to recruit from Howard. That same year, Thomas decided to write his dissertation on minimum wage effects in Puerto Rico instead of Say's law. He already had exposure from his Labor Department work. The problem was gathering enough statistics and data to arrive at consistent definitions. He hadn't abandoned the academic world, possibly the only place where a PhD would be worth it. During an AT&T convention, the chairman of Cornell University's economics department interviewed Thomas and offered him an opportunity to meet the rest of the department. Thomas said he was interested but wouldn't tolerate the kind of interference he'd encountered at the other two institutions. He was assured that wasn't the case at Cornell. Toward the end of the year, Thomas moved to Ithaca. Although he had a son and was taking a 25% pay cut, he looked forward to leaving New York, a good city, but not without its drawbacks. In 1965, Thomas started teaching at Cornell University. It was pleasant and the lightest workload he'd ever had, just 2 classes, one of which was the history of economic thought. This was the first time he was teaching his specialty. He was the only black professor in 1965, but he published more than any other faculty member, maybe more than all of them together. He'd only seen one black couple in Ithaca and one black student during his 3rd year at Cornell, but he kept in touch with the black community by recommending his former students to AT&T and government jobs. His engineering students in introductory economics considered all non-engineering classes breathers. Thomas didn't teach with graphs and math that engineering students could run through equations without understanding. He assigned readings and called on students in class. One day, when nobody had read the material, he dismissed the class. They couldn't discuss something nobody had read, but they'd still be tested on it. After the first exam came widespread failures and complaints to the chairman. When Thomas received the first call, he was dry in explaining he wouldn't grade on a curve or pass students who didn't do the work. The chairman showed up at his office shortly after, but the conversation ended when Thomas said he wouldn't budge. He'd been specifically promised no interference in his teaching methods. He was later told the engineering department paid to hold this economics course, and it would affect people voting on whether his contract should be renewed. Thomas said he'd keep making his own decisions on how to teach, and they could make their own when voting. He was ready to quit and go back to private industry. In 1966, Thomas decided to fulfill his language requirements for the dissertation and started learning French. When he began reading Sismondi on Say's law, he realized that this would be his dissertation topic again. Stigler showed him patience, though he was famous for having none. With his blessing, Thomas resumed work on his dissertation, tentatively under someone else's direction. At Cornell, he was voted a 3-year extension. Apparently, he had many defenders. In March 1968, Thomas had to give a speech at a Marx symposium at the University of New Hampshire. Because of snowstorm predictions, flying was unlikely, so he rented a car. Few hours later, he lost control after hitting a snow patch. The car spun and hit a concrete pillar. While the car was totaled, by some luck he came out unhurt. When he made it to the symposium, he said, "I'm glad to be here," and really meant it. His little boy was now 3 years old and still couldn't talk. He could clearly understand everything said to him, but would never speak, just point to things. He loved to pick locks. One time, Thomas saw him stare at a new lock without touching it, then reach out and open it on the first try. Another time, Thomas saw all the chess pieces scattered on the floor. The boy wasn't allowed to play with the chess set. Thomas ordered him to pick them up, and he put all 32 pieces back exactly in their positions. Incidents like this gave them hope, but they were too far apart, with weeks of silence between. Eventually, even his wife told Thomas he was being stubborn in not recognizing their son was mentally ill. At 3, the boy would only say wahi, water, and rocky. Thomas realized he'd say wahi only for bodies of water. When the boy once wanted to drink, Thomas pointed at the water fountain saying wahi, but the boy wouldn't repeat it. Eventually, his son became so frustrated at not being picked up, he started crying. Thomas picked him up right away. The crying stopped, but tears appeared in Tom's eyes. Thomas received a telephone call from a secretary at the University of Chicago. "When will you be ready to defend your dissertation?" "I didn't know it was accepted by the committee." "You didn't get the notice?" After years of struggle, his dissertation defense took 15 minutes, 10 for presentation, 5 for questions. Then Stigler and his other professors took him to a fancy restaurant to celebrate. The PhD was almost behind him, with only 2 foreign language exams left. He received a raise at Cornell and was paid well by the Rockefeller Foundation. The only negative was that his son still couldn't talk. Thomas couldn't spend as much time with him, and his wife wanted to resume her career. If they sent him to nursery school, he'd have no way of telling them how he liked it. There were more symptoms. The boy used to love when Thomas would throw him in the air and catch him. Now he was afraid, and Thomas had to stop. At Cornell, Thomas put together a program for black students. He picked the best ones from all universities, based on intellect, not sympathy. He had to fight bureaucracy to arrange their travels. One important thing was money for their living expenses. Thomas asked the administration a month in advance to prepare the money before the students arrived. A week before, he reminded them, but was told it was impossible to have the checks ready. After going from person to person, Thomas finally said, "I'm damn tired of this runaround. If I don't get the money before those kids get here, I'm phoning the Rockefeller Foundation to tell them how I'm being hamstrung by bureaucrats around here." Rockefeller Foundation were the magic words. He got the money. When summer program students arrived, Thomas would meet them at the airport and drive them to their dormitories in his little Volkswagen Bug. These students were doing as well as Cornell students in his economics class. Most were excellent. A few were causing trouble, and Thomas was told the administration could discontinue support if a student wasn't working in good faith. He talked with one student, who changed sufficiently. Another was a different story. That student phoned a white liberal professor from MIT, who phoned the economics department chairman on his behalf. The chairman reversed himself and made it appear noble to keep the student. Thomas argued with him for an hour, saying they should withdraw the funds, but the chairman folded to pressure from above. Thomas resigned from the university and the summer program, though he stayed the rest of the summer to finish it. A colleague phoned him. "I know you too well to influence your decision, but just hear me out to know your options." "Okay." Cornell has other programs with black students, and the pressure was from way above. "But if you stay, we'll match any offer you get from another university. You've got your PhD, your teaching reports are good, and you publish all the time. But we must preserve a certain image on racial matters. You can't wash our dirty laundry in public. If people on the inside are anxious to keep me quiet, it means they must figure someone will listen and give a damn." Thomas phoned the Rockefeller Foundation and told them everything. This is what it came to. Cornell didn't care if the student was unqualified, they cared about their image. This wasn't about helping black students, it was about looking like they were helping black students. Despite everything, the program was a success. Student exam scores rose 70 points after 28 classes. Thomas knew of no other program that did this. He resigned on August 24, 1968. Thomas Sowell walked away from Cornell with a PhD finally in hand, a marriage falling apart, a son who couldn't speak, and no job waiting for him. He was 38 years old. He'd been a high school dropout, a Marine, a Marxist, and now a man whose entire worldview had been shattered by what he'd seen in government offices and university hallways. But this wasn't the end of Thomas Sowell's story. It was just the beginning. What came next would define him. The quiet scholar who refused to lower his standards would become one of the most influential and controversial voices in American intellectual life. He would challenge everything the academic establishment believed about race, economics, and social policy. He would write books that sold millions of copies and columns that enraged his critics. He would become the economist that other economists couldn't ignore, even when they wished they could. And he would do it all while never compromising, never backing down, and never playing by anyone else's rules. The transformation from Marxist to free market advocate was complete, but the real fight was just beginning.